A black attorney thought it would be just another flight home after burying her mother. But the moment she stepped up to the gate, everything changed. A gate agent singled her out, ignoring dozens of larger bags, and claimed her carry-on was oversized. What happened next exposed a hidden pattern of discrimination, triggered a corporate firestorm, and launched a movement no one saw coming. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, drop a comment below and tell us, where in the world are you watching from today? And if this story moves you, don't forget to subscribe for more true stories that reveal the truth beneath the surface. It started like any ordinary day, but turned into something that changed the way an entire industry operates. They say time heals. But time, for people like us, has always been a liar. Evelyn Mercer stood at the airport gate, not just with a carry-on bag, but with the weight of 3 generations clutched in her hands. Inside, her mother's recipe cards, a faded silk scarf, a photograph of 2 children smiling in black and white. Objects so ordinary the world wouldn't glance twice, but for her, they were sacred. She wasn't just traveling. She was carrying a memory. And memory for us is never light. She had buried her mother 3 days earlier in New Orleans soil. The kind of burial that doesn't end when the last hymn fades, but lingers, follows you through metal detectors and TSA lines. Her eyes were dry now, not from peace, but from the exhaustion of mourning in motion. The flight back to Chicago was meant to be a quiet return to normalcy, or the closest thing to it. But for Black folks in America, even the illusion of normalcy is a privilege rarely granted. She noticed it before they even called her group. A white man with a suitcase so large it rattled as he rolled it. No one blinked. No one questioned. He boarded without pause. Then another. And another. Each bag violates the supposed standard with impunity. Evelyn waited. Patient. Poised. Then came her turn. And the woman at the gate, a thin-lipped agent with a frozen smile, leaned forward, eyebrows raised, and said, "Ma'am, I'll need to check your carry-on." That was the moment. That small, barely spoken moment. The kind of moment you might miss if you'd never had to live it. But if you had, if you'd spent a lifetime being quietly questioned, subtly challenged, delicately diminished, then you recognized it instantly. She could have shrugged it off. She would have complied. That's what they count on. That you're too tired, too sad, too afraid of seeming angry. But something stirred. Not rage. Not even a surprise. Just recognition. Because this wasn't about a bag. This was about a pattern. The agent didn't touch the bags of those who looked like her. But Evelyn? Evelyn's bag, a bag that had flown for years without incident, was now suddenly suspicious. Out of spec. Subject to scrutiny. And isn't that always the story? We're asked to carry the weight. Then punished for how heavy it's become. So Evelyn straightened her back. She took a breath. And for the first time since her mother passed, she felt something other than grief. She felt clarity. This moment would not go unspoken. Because even small humiliations, when repeated across a lifetime, become shackles. And somewhere in her mother's voice, echoing faintly in memory, she heard the whisper. Don't just endure, baby. Remember. The frame was crooked. Not by accident. Not by storm. Not by wear and tear. By design. Evelyn watched as the gate agent adjusted the measuring rack, fingers moving with casual confidence, pulling the metal bar just slightly inward. Just enough. Just barely enough. But enough all the same. The trick wasn't new. It had different names in different decades: poll taxes, literacy tests, dress codes, tone. But it always amounted to the same thing, a moving target that only moved when we approached it. Place your bag in the frame, please. There was no warmth in the woman's voice, only the rehearsed cadence of bureaucracy. But Evelyn, like so many Black women before her, had long since learned how to listen beneath the words. She lowered her carry-on into the metal cage, the same carry-on that had seen the sky more than most pilots. But now, inside this frame, it suddenly didn't fit. Looks like it's oversized, the woman declared. Her voice now louder, a little brighter, made for an audience. There's a $75 fee to check it. Evelyn stood still. Not out of fear, but calculation. Because moments like these are never just moments. They are tests, administered daily to Black folks with no warning and no grading curve. Behind her, the line grew. Behind her, the silence grew louder. Behind her stood a white man with a bag nearly bursting at the seams. He was not measured. He was waved through. And here it was again, the tension Baldwin had always named. That peculiar American genius of making injustice look like policy. Evelyn breathed through her nose. Steady. Controlled. Her mother had warned her, they want the show of your anger more than the justice of your facts. But grief had sharpened her patience into something else, something steel. I've flown with this bag for 5 years, she said quietly. Her voice didn't rise. It sank, deep, precise, cutting. Are you going to measure this? The agent blinked. Sir, you may board. Evelyn didn't move. She didn't need to move. Because standing still, with truth in your chest and history on your back, is its own kind of revolution. You adjusted the frame, she said. I watched you. The agent shifted her weight. A flicker of doubt passed through her face like a cloud over the sun. But this was not about the agent. Not entirely. She was just a finger on a much larger hand. A system that smiles when it denies. A system that punishes without bruises. A system that asks, why are you so angry? While steadily feeding you reason to be. The gate agent called for a supervisor. And Evelyn, still rooted, still calm, slipped her phone from her coat pocket. She began to record. Because in a world that doesn't always believe Black voices, sometimes you must show them what they choose not to hear. And so the next challenge arrived, not with a shout, but with a smile. A middle-aged white man with a name tag and practiced empathy, ready to de-escalate. Evelyn looked at him and thought, you are not my enemy, sir. But you are not neutral either. This was not about a bag. This was about measurement. And in America, we have always been measured by weight, by skin, by silence. But now, she has decided to measure them back. There is a particular ache that comes from knowing you're right, and knowing it won't matter. Not to them. Evelyn Mercer stood before the supervisor, her phone raised, her voice level. The air between them was tight with performance, hers of grace, his of control. I'm simply asking, she said, for consistent application of your policy. Simple words. But in America, simple words from a Black woman often fall like thunder. The man, middle-aged, polite, and practiced, smiled in that way only white authority does when it believes it's still in control. I'm sure this is all a misunderstanding. But Evelyn was not here for comfort. She had buried her mother 3 days ago. She had no room left for misunderstandings. The truth was plain and painful. Black passengers were being singled out, measured, charged, corrected, while white passengers rolled by with silence and overstuffed privilege. She named it. Out loud. In front of them. A kind of sacrilege in an airport where efficiency matters more than equity. And yet, one voice stirred. I've been watching too, the white man behind her said. My bag's bigger than hers. There it was, proof, not just from the oppressed, but the privileged. And suddenly, the entire theater of policy began to wobble under its own lie. But Baldwin taught us. The lie doesn't fall easily. It leans. It bends. It clings. The supervisor turned to the agent. The agent turned to the frame. And Evelyn, still recording, turned to the truth. Please, she said, measure my bag again. But this time, don't touch the frame. Now the moment wasn't just heavy. It was dangerous. Because in this America, truth is never neutral. It is a provocation. It is a weapon. It is a mirror held up to a face that refuses to see itself. The measuring rack was straightened. The bag, unchanged, untouched, slid in perfectly. Silence. Not the silence of peace. The silence of exposure. You're free to board, the supervisor said at last, the words strained through clenched teeth. But Evelyn didn't move. I'd like your employee ID, she said. And a written explanation of how passengers are selected for measurement. Now came the real storm, not of volume, but of resistance. That won't be necessary, the supervisor muttered, attempting retreat. It was a misunderstanding. But Evelyn knew better. She had lived too long, seen too much, buried too many. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was understanding too well how the system works. It works like this. Call it random. Say it's standard. Hope the person is too tired, too grieving, too polite to speak. But Evelyn had buried her mother with dignity. She would not bury her voice too. By the time Evelyn sat down in seat 14A, her hands were steady. But the storm inside her had found its rhythm. She had won the moment. Yes, but victory for Black folk is often bittersweet. Because it rarely tastes like justice. More often, it tastes like restraint. The plane lifted off, and below her the city shrank. But what she carried had not grown lighter. In the pocket under the seat in front of her, nestled quietly, was the navy blue bag. The same bag. The bag that started it. And yet, it had never been the bag at all. It had been her face. Her skin. Her presence. That quiet, devastating crime of existing in a space not designed for you, yet refusing to shrink. As she stared out the window, Evelyn thought of her mother, Ruth Mercer. The woman who had taught English to generations of Black students in Louisiana, but who, in her own quiet way, taught resistance too. Keep your chin up, Ruth used to say. But don't ever let them hang their guilt on your dignity. Now, with the hum of the engine in her ears and a cold can of sparkling water in her hand, Evelyn remembered something else. Her mother had always carried her bag onto the plane. Never checked it. Never trusted it to others. At the time, Evelyn had called it frugality. Now, she wondered, was it protection? Because when you live your whole life being watched, searched, delayed, you begin to move like a fugitive in your own country. The flight attendant, a young woman named Lena, offered her a soft glance. A glance that said, "I saw what happened," even if no words were exchanged. And this is the other truth of being Black in America. The solidarity is often silent but fierce. We know each other's battles even when we don't speak them aloud. Later in the flight, Lena leaned in, her voice low. "Let me guess," she said. "They tried to make you check it." Evelyn nodded. Lena hesitated, then said, almost whispering, "It happens more than you'd think. And mostly to, well, you know." Yes, she knew. And that's what made this different. This wasn't a one-time insult. It was part of a pattern, rehearsed and refined. A quiet choreography of bias. Evelyn felt her grief shift, not disappear, but rearrange itself. Grief, when touched by injustice, becomes fuel. Not rage, not vengeance, but something deeper, something called purpose. She opened her laptop. And while others on the plane watched movies, played solitaire, or dozed against plastic windows, Evelyn began to build. She wrote everything down. The names, the faces, the measurements, the contradiction between what was said and what was done. She traced the invisible map of every Black traveler whose bag had been too big. Every voice was too tired to argue. Because grief, Baldwin once wrote, is not a weakness. It is proof that love once existed. And love, when denied justice, becomes unstoppable. The plane had landed. But Evelyn had not yet come down from altitude. Not really. She moved through the terminal as if underwater. The rush of people, the announcements, the plastic smiles of the airport flashing past her like shadows on a wall. She had arrived in Chicago. But she had brought something with her from New Orleans. Besides her mother's recipes and her grief, she had brought the question. A quiet question that grew louder each time she turned it over in her mind. How many of us has this happened to? It was the kind of question that doesn't seek answers, it seeks witnesses. And the witnesses came. First, it was an email. Then a message from a woman named Naomi Brooks, a tech consultant. Then another. And another. All Black. All women. All professionals. All accused, quietly, coldly, publicly, of breaking a rule they hadn't broken. All told their bags were too big. All told, in different words, you don't belong here the way you think you do. Evelyn read each story and recognized herself in them. But more frightening, she recognized her mother. And her mother's mother. And all the women before them who had endured insult with a grace that often went unthanked. Because grace is expected when you are black and female and visible. She could not sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the dark, lit only by the screen of her laptop, documenting testimony like scripture. The rhythm of the stories was identical. A gate agent, a bag, a random check, a fee, a shrug. It became clear to her what it always becomes clear to us eventually. It was not random. It was not neutral. It was revenue, yes, but revenue from us. We are charged for our presence, taxed for our dignity, fined for our existence. But this time, the receipts were adding up. A flight attendant named Lena Chin reached out next. Soft voice, careful language. She didn't want to lose her job. But she had seen it too. We were trained to focus on certain passengers, she said. Not explicitly. Never directly. But, you know. Yes, Evelyn knew. It is the genius of American racism. To hide itself in professionalism. To disguise its patterns as policy. To present its prejudices in PowerPoint slides. Now Evelyn saw what she had only sensed before. This was not one woman's experience. This was a business model. And business had been very, very good. Evelyn Mercer did not plan to become the center of anything. She had not boarded the plane to start a movement. She had not carried her mother's recipes through security thinking they would become evidence. But the thing about injustice, real injustice, is that it clings. It stains your hands, even when you try to wash them in silence. She had planned to return to work quietly, to ease back into the rhythm of legal briefs and early morning meetings, to let the grief settle in the back room of her mind. But the stories kept coming. The names, the flights, the patterns. And something inside her refused to sit down. It was not ambition. It was not pride. It was the memory of her mother. Of all the women who had been stopped, doubted, charged, and dismissed. Their faces never made the news. Their complaints never made the boardroom. But they remembered. And now they were speaking. Evelyn and her colleague Marcus Jameson, a weary optimist with a fire behind his eyes, began building the case. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. First, the truth. They gathered records. Filed Freedom of Information Act requests. Pulled internal training documents from sympathetic employees. And what they found, what we always find, was a system dressed in politeness, wearing a suit of data but hiding a dagger behind its back. They found what they were meant to find. Revenue optimization charts that targeted high-opportunity passengers. Training slides that coded race as risk. And compliance as opportunity. Let's not be naive. The language was vague. The language always is. But Baldwin told us long ago, it is not necessary that you believe the lie. It is enough that you accept it. That you live by it. The airlines were not lynching anybody. They were not using slurs. But they were doing what this nation has always done when no one is looking. They were profiting off silence. And Evelyn, still in mourning, still catching her breath, knew that silence would no longer do. The question came, clear and simple. Are you going to fight this alone? And Evelyn, like every woman who has ever buried her mother and seen the world unchanged the next morning, answered, I don't intend to fight it alone at all. By the time Evelyn received the invitation, she already knew what it was. Not an apology. Not a reckoning. A warning disguised as hospitality. A senior legal representative from the airline had requested a private meeting. They called it an opportunity to discuss concerns. But what they meant was, how do we keep this quiet? It was not her first time in a glass-walled office overlooking a city that did not know her name. But this time, she walked in not as counsel, but as a witness. The executive smiled the way powerful white men often do when they are not sure whether to charm or contain you. He offered coffee, compliments, and a chair. And then he got to the point. Miss Mercer, we value all our customers. And we're prepared to offer you a private resolution, financial compensation, an apology letter, and premium status for life. That was the moment. That was the moment so many of us are taught to be grateful for. to take the money, to nod, to say at least they noticed. But Evelyn had seen too much. She had read too many emails from women with tears behind their sentences. She had heard the tremble in the voice of the flight attendant who whispered, "They tell us not to say it, but we all know who gets stopped." She did not raise her voice. She raised the mirror. "I'm not interested in compensation," she said. "I'm interested in justice." The executive shifted in his seat as if her words had weight. And of course they did. Because truth, real, unbending truth, is heavier than any settlement. She slid her folder across the table. Inside, the stories, the data, the image of the training slide that categorized Black passengers as opportunity. The room grew quiet. Not from shock, but recognition. They knew. They always knew. They had simply built a system sturdy enough to deny it. "We don't admit to any discriminatory policy," the executive said. "Of course you don't," Evelyn replied. "Because if you did, you'd have to stop it." He looked at her differently now, not as a passenger, but as a threat. And in that moment, Evelyn understood something that every elder Black American has long known. They don't fear your anger. They fear your clarity. Because clarity makes you dangerous. It makes you immune to distraction. It makes you unwilling to be bought. She stood. "You have 48 hours," she said, "to present a reform plan. Or I go public with names, numbers, and the truth your silence has sold for profit." The walk out of the office was quiet. But inside her, something loud was rising. Not rage. Not revenge. A deeper knowledge. That the world doesn't change because the powerful feel shame. It changes when the wounded decide they've had enough of bleeding in silence. Change, when it comes, does not arrive with fanfare. It arrives like the hush before a storm. It arrives like an old song, sung in a different key. Evelyn Mercer returned to the same airport weeks later. Same gate. Same bag. But something had shifted. Not in the sky. Not yet. But in the air. The measuring device was still there. But now it stood straight, clear, transparent, unmoved. And the agent? She greeted Evelyn with nothing but procedure. No side glances. No pauses. No performance. Just process. Finally, just process. That was how Evelyn knew something had changed. Because nothing happened at all. But that change, however quiet, had been fought for. Carved from resistance. Hammered out of grief. And paid for in sleepless nights and the currency of courage. It hadn't come from conscience. It had come from pressure. After Evelyn refused the settlement, she went public. The story spread. The silence broke. What began as one woman's grief-tinged defiance became a collective echo. And those echoes became a voice. And that voice became policy. Airlines scrambled. Committees were formed. Audits were launched. They called it reform. But we, those who have lived long enough to know the names change but the harm repeats, we knew it for what it was. A beginning. Later that month, Evelyn received a letter. Not from the airline, but from an elderly woman in North Carolina. "I'm 74, it read. "They charged me 3 times this year for my carry-on. My grandson said I should complain. But I didn't think anyone would believe me. Then I read about you." She kept that letter tucked in her wallet. Not because it offered praise, but because it proved that resistance multiplies. Evelyn had not ended racism. She had not dismantled capitalism. She had not reversed the long, bitter logic of America's flight from itself. But she had refused to be measured by a crooked frame. And in doing so, she had straightened the frame for others. That is what justice looks like in this country. It is never grand. It is never whole. It is a gate left open just wide enough for the next one to walk through untouched. And for those of us who have lived long enough to know how high that gate once stood, that matters.